Welcome to this July edition of Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. Today we are taking a look at Men Without Women by Haruki Murakami. Now, to give the listener some perspective, Haruki Murakami is one of my top four favorite authors, the other three being Harlan Ellison, Douglas Adams, and Ayn Rand. And Murakami is Haruki Murakami is one of those authors that writes just completely in his own universe. And when I say there's nothing like it, there really isn't. He has a very unique voice. Broadly speaking, his stories fall into two categories, and it's very similar to what we were talking about with Paul Auster, which is his stories fall into these two categories of surrealist, kind of magic realism, surrealist stories, and then kind of slice of life, coming of age, life story kind of things. And often they converge. And we're often, when we read his stories, we're often wondering if what we're being presented with is literally happening or if it's a metaphor, that sort of thing. And regardless, the stories tend to be just fascinating and very multi-layered with a lot of perspective. And he's the sort of author that you have to take and kind of contemplate from various different angles. I had the pleasure, one of the great milestones in my life was getting to meet Haruki Murakami, which is a privilege that very few people have enjoyed. And what happened was he came to speak at a lecture, give a lecture that was open to the public at MIT, and I was across the river at Berkeley. So I went over with two of my Japanese friends, both named Keiko, and me and the Keikos went over there, and we sat and watched Haruki Murakami speak. And he read one of his stories. It was the one from after the quake about the giant toad that fights an earthworm, and it was fascinating. At the Q&A, I asked him what role jazz played in his writing, and he told me that being a lifelong fan of jazz, he has always approached his stories in an improvisational context, that he considers his stories to be like jazz solos. So that was really cool. But one of the professors that introduced him summarized Haruki Murakami's work perfectly. He said, Haruki Murakami does not show us a world that we have never seen. He shows us the world we see every day and don't realize we are seeing. And I think that, more than anything, just perfectly summarizes what Haruki Murakami is, what he's about, his headspace as he writes. And the book we're looking at today is his latest release, Men Without Women. And what's interesting to me, I've noticed in recent times, there have been a couple of corollaries in Murakami's themes with certain issues that would be of common discussion in men's groups, men's rights groups, that kind of thing. His last novel, his last novel translated into English, I should say, was called Colorless Sakura Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. And that one was about a spoiler alert, big spoiler alert. That one was about a man who got a false rape accusation. And this book is about men who, for whatever reason, are separated from the men in their lives. Let me say that again. This is a story about men who, for whatever reason, are separated from the women in their lives. And so, going into it, you might almost expect a MGTOW, men going their own way kind of premise. In both of these cases, though, where the themes might coincide with these political topics that have been discussed lately, that's really not what he's doing. That's really not what he's trying to cover. It's not a political statement. It's more about the personal meditation. And if you if you've read Murakami, you know that one of his ongoing themes is kind of people who are trying to disconnect from the larger society, and that's obviously a cultural mainstay of Japan, where the salary man working, until you literally working yourself to death. They call it karoshi. That's kind of a common way of life, and Murakami's characters tend to want to push away from that. So, with all of that in mind, we're going to go story by story and talk about the different themes, the different ideas. But Stefan, let me turn it over to you. This is your first Murakami book. What was your overall impression?
Generally, with any sort of Japanese author or any Asian author, really, they have a certain sensibility and mannerism about them that the West or the European doesn't have, or the European author doesn't have. So it's very romantic. It's very poetic. It's almost sparkling when they describe things. There's some moments of spirituality based on their religions here and there, but it's generally that's the feeling you get, and I've gotten that from amateur writers all throughout my teachings and my readings. So you're going to have this sort of quaint, and I hate saying that because his books aren't just quaint. They're much more than that, but they're very personal.
Mm-hmm.
So you sort of lose the meaning because you don't quite grasp exactly what this bar means or what the bar should mean or what the character should mean. So it's very personal, and it's sort of lost on me because it's too philosophical or it's too profound. But essentially, this is a story about adultery. And I thought it was going to be men going their own way that don't have to bother with women. But this is really about men who have either discovered women through adultery or have discovered their first loves. And for any guy, there must be some sort of, I don't know, generational experience or some sort of evolutionary reasoning why we are so depressed and hung up on our first loves and our first girlfriends or our first wives, and why it nags at us all this long time throughout our lives. We still think about these women for some reason. And he explores upon that. Now, obviously, that can be talked about by any male who writes romance, who will, say his first love means so much and whatever, all regardless of perfections. This is what meant the world to them, and we just sort of keep having this emotion that drags us down and keeps us reminiscing. Whereas women are a lot different. Women just get over it very efficiently. Again, we don't know why. So this explores. I think most of the stories explore that element of adultery and longing and discovery of, wow, this was actually in my life and now it's gone and I have to deal with it. So that's, I think, the major theme. And I just wish that he was consistent in framing that theme with all his stories, because there's a point within the 7 stories we're looking at where he just drops the frame. Yep. And that is, to me, is a faux pas. Yeah. So I have to take off points for that. But other than that, the individual stories are quite beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I agree. This is, I was expecting to find maybe stories about men who are, involuntary celibates or whatever, who for whatever reason have no connection at all with women. And that's not what he's getting at. This is really like just the men who have known women, who have known incredible women, and the pain of losing them, and the many dimensions of that. And I think that with that in mind, that's a great framing device for the first story that we're going to look at, which is called Drive My Car. This is about, without going into too much detail, it's basically about 2 men who love the same woman. They're both actors. One was married to her, and the other was a man who did a movie with her. This woman was an actress herself. She has died. And now the man who was her husband, who is an actor, and the man who was her scene partner, who is an actor, are meeting. And it's really, ultimately, really about that meeting. I won't get into why it's called Drive My Car and all of that, although, well, actually I will in a sense, because there is a literal component to that, in that the widowed spouse seeks out a woman to be his professional driver so he can study his scripts while he's being taken to the set. but it seems like there's also an undercurrent theme there when you're talking about drive my car. This is a man who has essentially been cuckolded by this other man, and saying when you say drive my car, there's always this masculine correlation made in popular culture between women and cars. Obviously there's an obvious connection, like the girl in high school wants to go out with the guy that has a nice car and that kind of thing, or whatever. There's a very shallow connection, but symbolically, I think he's making a very profound statement. It's not just that he's finding this woman to drive his car to and from the set, also driving my car, taking over this crucial aspect of my existence, is what this other lover of his wife's did. Took over that role in his life. And so for me, that was a very profound metaphor. And I like how Murakami handles some very delicate moments in this story. What did you think?
Well, this was actually one of my favorite stories just because it was very unique and personal and started off very well. You have this late middle-aged actor who has some sort of driving violation, so he needs someone to drive his car. And it's like a sob, like one of those really schnazzy 1980s, at least from my experience, my growing up, Swiss cars, like really like schwanky little car. And he's not a rich actor. He just he likes the finer things in life, I guess. And because he's such a good actor, he has this intuition with people, and everything with him was an act. And the whole premise of the story hinges on his intuition about his wife having adultery with these four other men at least. And he never really finds evidence, but he understands his wife so much, and the way she describes these men, because she works with them and that's how she met them, that he knows this is going on. And this could all just be a delusion. This could all just be in his head. He could just be thinking this whole thing up. And when he talks to one of these men and he gets to know them, he says, okay, yeah, obviously this guy really cared about my wife in a much deeper way than the average fellow would, because this was a very average fellow, this actor that he talks to. So it makes you go, okay, maybe there's some credence here. Maybe this guy is really intelligent, and he just never understood his wife's needs or what was going on in the relationship there after the tragic thing happened in their family.
Mm-hmm.
So that itself, like with the driver, and it's like driving Miss Daisy, but for the Japanese actor, psychological insight person, and he's doing everything. He's an actor. He can just do any role. He's memorizing his lines. He doesn't have to he doesn't need to listen to his lines in the car. He's listening to classical music. He's listening to jazz. He's listening to all these things, and he's focusing on this one guy, trying to see if there's a crack in whether he's going to confess his adultery, and it never happens. So it's this big what if in the story. What if this actually happened? Why can't I get this guy to talk? What do I want to do with this knowledge if I do get it? And that's this big suspense throughout the entire story.
Mm.
And it's just stretched all the way. You're just wondering what's happening. This goes on to the next two other stories.
Yeah.
And to me, this was the frame. This was the whole point.
Yeah.
And this is why I felt that the rest of the story, the rest of the book really fell apart, because the frame is just instantly forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why, because it was such a great setup. Everything was jiving. And I thought, in my little mind, that the other stories were parts of a play he was acting out, because they're so detailed, and he's such a good actor, and this is how he does his stuff. And it never came around, and I was like, why did he set it up this way? I was just banging my head going, what is the point of all this?
I see where you're coming from with that, I do think that theme, that tension, does stretch into some of the other stories. What I love, though, is, and it really does speak to Murakami's strengths, that he can state so much, he can say so much in what is understated and what is not said between people, what is assumed, what we come to understand without it being stated, That is incredible. It's like they say the best jazz musician makes the silences just as meaningful as the notes, and that's what Murakami does. And I think he does it very well in Drive My Car. So, what about Yesterday, Stefan? You introduced this one.
Oh, jeez, I'm trying to remember this one because this is the one in between Drive My Car and Independent that, geez, I'm trying to remember what it was about actually. This is the one that did not leave an impression on me at all. Can you actually refresh my memory? I'll probably have a strong opinion. Just let me remember
Sure,
it.
I'll bring it in. So Yesterday is actually it's a story, and like the previous one, yes, it's named after a Beatles song.
Oh
Uh,
yes, I remember now. Thank you.
yeah, it's about a kind of a and one thing you have to understand in these stories is a lot of times Murakami is not just telling the story. He sets up an independent narrator of the story to tell you about the person that's telling the story, if
Th-
that makes sense.
this was such an interesting story because it's the same character from the first story, and now he's telling a story about his experience with a friend he met for a few months when he was growing up or young man.
Yeah.
They're working at a some sort of restaurant,
Hmm.
and he has this girlfriend of his, and he's trying very hard not to be from Tokyo because they have a certain way of talking, and he learns this whole dialect from the boonies of some province or whatnot, what have you, just because he wanted to, because he's a smart guy and he does that, but he has no other drive in life to do things seriously. At least that's what it seems like. But he has this childhood girlfriend of his that he grew up with. This is probably a very classical theme or element in these stories where you grow up with this girl and you pinky swear that you're going to marry her, and he never sees her as a woman.
Hmm.
He knows that she's gorgeous. Like even the guy was so astounded at how beautiful this woman is, and this friend he meets just cannot commit to her in a serious way, and it's just this strange behavior from this eccentric guy who just cannot get his mind around thinking of this childhood sweetheart of his as a woman and how to grow as a man with her.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it made me do so much thinking because there are these subtle things that I've never thought about. I can remember, times here and there where, like, I would, as growing up, that different friends of mine would realize that maybe a certain girl was interested. And when I say this, I'm talking about like late teenage through college, that kind of thing. They would notice a certain girl was interested in me, and they'd be like, "Hey, man, you need to, can't you tell she's digging on you and everything?" And my feeling was like, well, I need this person to, I need to have this person like me and want to be with me, but not be with me, and not to hurt them in any way, or not to be like a carrot on a stick, so to speak, but to, I need to have this feeling of disconnect. This feeling needs to be a part of my life, and I've never come to an explanation of why or understanding what that was, but I feel like that's what's happening here. This guy is like, he's trying to understand why he needs this woman why he wants this woman who is obviously in love with him, who wants to be with him, all of this, why he's keeping her in this state of limbo. Why, and he's trying to figure out, why is this important? Why am I doing this? Why am I, and by proxy, the narrator is trying to help him find out as well. And that was really fascinating to me. That's what I thought it was, kind of focusing on. What do you think?
It's strange because there are people in our lives that we're attracted to that we say, "Wow, this is obviously I'm very much into this person," and there's something about them that they were like, "Okay, well, I'm not going to devote my life to you,"
Yeah.
or for whatever reason you just don't click, or you try too hard, or you don't try hard enough, and the attitude that, or the philosophy, I don't know if you can call it that, it wasn't really advice. It was more like, well, why don't you just do what you want?
Hmm.
And to him, that was like, yeah, I will. That's what he's always done. So he's just going to keep doing what he's always done, as opposed to realizing, listen, this is a woman, you are a man, You know exactly who she is. She knows exactly who you are. You have to change, and he does. He never changes.
Hmm.
He keeps doing his own thing, and that is, I mean, it's a very profound thing to say because you're passing up on this opportunity.
Hmm.
What does that mean to him? We don't know.
Yeah.
But the fact is, he becomes his own person,
Hmm.
and that was just the narrator's view because this woman was absolutely striking.
Hmm.
How could any warm-blooded rational male or irrational male not realize this? And he could not get over that bump of
Hmm.
her being this little girl that he enjoyed playing with as a little boy,
Yeah.
and it never matured from there. So it's almost like a failure to launch sort of story
Hmm.
when parents have children, or a girl not seeing her best friend as a lover, or any sort of coming of age story that has its own specific reason for being. And it's definitely not a way that I would have imagined a man. And again, this is all Japanese, but it feels, because it's using the Beatles theme of music and taking the lyrics. And this was the guy who was taking those lyrics, and because it got translated in an odd way, and another band played it with deranged lyrics or different lyrics, and he would sing that very well. And so you're seeing and hearing this idea of Yesterday is one of their best, beautiful songs. And it's just saying, yeah, this is what happened. This is what I did. And it's such a tragic little anecdote without being tragic, because you can't feel it. You just say this is what he did.
Hmm.
But he just let go of all that. In reality, they never really expand upon his emotions. It's just this thing he did, and that's it, and that's that. And then he sees her later in life, and it's just like, yeah, that's what happened, and she's still single, and she's still doing her thing, and
Yeah.
that was life for
Yeah.
them.
It is. It's such an odd, that meeting at the end was so interesting to me because it is such an odd moment like that. And in a way there is the primary narrator who's telling about this guy and everything. He has ends up having that similar disconnect with this woman. And it's strange kind of that aura, how that aura kind of projects from one person to the next. So the next story was An Independent Organ. This was one of my favorite stories in the book. A very savage story. It has, in a way, it has a character that is almost, I mean, in a way, I mean, he is a womanizer and he's very misogynistic in a lot of ways. But it's about a man. Again, this is one of those stories where we have a primary narrator that is telling the story of this person. So they know each other, and he's telling the story of this person. And this guy that he's talking about is a plastic surgeon who works with women primarily, and he has so many female partners. He or so many lovers and everything, and he's a big shot player and all of this. And throughout his life, just tons and tons of women, and then he is essentially finally destroyed by rejection from the one woman that he truly wants to be with. Which it's a fairly simple idea, and so much so one might even say that it's a little trite, but he has some fascinating observations, and the title, "An Independent Organ," comes from the idea that at the end he says that women have an independent organ that allows them to lie. That they don't even when it comes time to lie, their moral faculty shuts off, and this other organ kicks in, and they're able to lie without it compromising their conscience. And that's why you can't tell when women are lying. All this. Well, it seems like this very, again, misogynistic feeling or sentiment or observation there. But if you look at what's really being said there, this is a guy who has spent his his entire life essentially putting on a false front, putting on a mask, and that's one of the themes we've seen in these first three stories is characters that, for whatever reason, are putting on a false front. We have actors. We have a guy who's taught himself to speak a hillbilly dialect so that he sounds less cultured than he is, or less refined than he is. And in this one, you have a plastic surgeon that sees all these different women, and metaphorically, he's helping people put on masks. He's covering up who they really are. And so it feels like this shot of reality, like he has lived in this fantasy world for so long, he gets this shot of reality, and it's too much to bear. You know what I mean? And that's what I took away.
This was I wouldn't say it's straightforward, but I wouldn't say the fellow was misogynistic. He was, they take a lot, or the writer takes a lot of effort to describe this guy's lifestyle
Mm-hmm.
and how careful he is, how mature he is, how open he is, how private he is with the women, and the women know what they're doing, and they know they're committing adultery,
Mm-hmm.
and he's, sending them on their way, or if they get too attached, he lets go. He's very careful, and he's not playing around in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like obviously he's going out with all these women, but he's never committing. He's
Yep.
never trying to seduce. He's just, hey, welcome to my store. I'm here to help you. You have these other problems aside from physical problems, and he takes care of them.
Yeah.
So the fact that he never fell in love before is a little hard for me to grasp, considering his sophistication and understanding of the female psyche, that
Mm-hmm.
he is able to talk to women and get to know them and be personable with them. So for this to happen in his late, was it 50 or 40 or whatever? 40, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's sort of like, well, this is strange.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he's talking to the narrator going, I've never felt this way about someone before. Well, it's like, well, that's nothing new. You can meet a total stranger tomorrow and never feel about them before. So it hits him so differently that he's almost, he almost loses himself. And effectively he does. And that's the part where I'm like, wait a second, this guy has been with so many women, he's dated so many, he's experienced so much, he knows women lie, yada, 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 he still breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of like watching, I don't know, Frasier. And the final episode is Frasier commits suicide or something. Great.
Yeah.
It's like what? How did that happen?
Yeah.
So it's a little hard for me to put my head around.
Mm-hmm.
But it was definitely this is a very good progression of the frame, and the frame being the actor character from the previous two stories, telling about his life, telling about his lifestyle, the people he knows, the people he talked to, and this was one of his friends. And it was such a very unique story for him to be telling a story about this fellow he met who's so well deserved, and he's professional. He's good with people. He's very friendly. He knows kids. He gets along with everyone, and all of a sudden his life just gets turned upside down. So that was different. This is also the complete drop of the frame. When I say the frame, I mean the frame narrative,
Mm-hmm.
meaning the main character and his problems with his car and his driver and his wife and his adulterers. This is what breaks the rest of the book. It's not really a book anymore. This becomes an anthology, but
Yeah.
I don't know why. And it's like going to an art gallery and you see a collage in one canvas of all these stories, and then you see this 1/3 of a frame that's just hanging there and you're like, why? Why did you? Is the frame supposed to mean something? Is the frame supposed to be broken or dropped? Or
Yeah.
I want to know what the author was going through to say, why did you stop using this character?
Yeah.
Why did the frame end? And the only comparison I could think to is like the Princess Bride, where you have Peter Falk and he's talking to Fred Savage. He
Mm-hmm.
starts things up. Sometimes he breaks in here and there, but then the story just gets going, and then it comes back at the end with the frame. So I was hoping that the frame would come back, or the main character would come back and tie it all up. And this is where it just gets dropped, and I don't know why. And it's just such a sloppy bad form
Mm.
to do that. I think to a reader of these kinds of works.
I where did you what inference did you make that the character or the narrator from the first two stories were the same person? Did that I don't recall that coming up specifically.
Uh, the talks he had over people he met at bars. I thought that was in yesterday. Was that not it?
I believe you may be thinking of Kino.
No, no, no. That's later on. That's
Yeah,
like one of the middle stories.
but
I thought,
I can tell you this: talks, people sitting in bars chatting is a constant theme in Murakami's writing, or a constant
right. So I was
development.
under the impression because the first one he talks to that adulterer in a bar. He has very few friends who he does that with.
Yeah.
And yesterday he meets his friends in a bar. So like, okay, this is where he got started.
Hmm.
And in the third one, again, another guy in a bar. So maybe the descriptions weren't like this. This is actually consistent in the other stories as well that we'll go into. The
Yeah.
next one, for sure, has a ridiculous setup. I
Yeah.
can't even wrap my brain around.
Yeah.
And it's
Well,
like, where did this come from? So without the frame, without the context, I am totally lost why he set this up
yeah.
or what was the like because the first story is big.
Yeah.
It's the biggest one. It's like, okay, he's established a character, he's established the frame, or he established the reason for things happening. And the second and third ones, I assumed were more stories that he was telling his driver.
Yeah.
I assumed maybe the description wasn't there. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me.
Mm.
I
Well,
just
I mean, obviously, it drops from the first person narrative at that point, so that probably that's part of it.
possibly, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the next three stories are all in are all in the third person. Rather, one thing I do know though is that when you're reading Murakami, and this again comes from being kind of a vintage Murakami fan, is one of the things you start to realize is that a lot of the characters, the main characters, tend to seem just kind of like an avatar for Murakami himself. So much so that when I saw him in person, it really was like meeting that narrator character. Um, and it feels kind of like a situation like in fact in one of the stories he actually shows up as Hikaru Makimura, but it's one of those things like when you see a Woody Allen movie and yeah he's playing a different character in Sleeper than in Annie Hall and a different character than that in Manhattan and all of that. He's playing technically different characters, but these are still think pieces about Woody Allen's psyche, what is going on in Woody Allen's head. And that's kind of the same thing that happens with a lot of Murakami's stories. I mean, his first four books, which were, they're actually, I believe Norwegian Wood interrupts the sequence, but there are four books that have the same character, and that's Hear the Wind Sing, Pinball 1978, and then A Wild Sheep Chase and Dance Dance Dance. Those four all have the same main character, but if you read Sputnik Sweetheart or South of the Border, East of the Sun, or really any of his major works that are told in the first person, you would come away from it thinking all of those were the same main character, just because they are so consistently fitting that narrative or that style. And so really it does, in fact, in his collection Blind Willow Sleeping Woman, there's a point where he actually does in one of the stories say you need to understand the story, you need to know that it really is me, Haruki Murakami, that experienced these things. Which is great too, because he talks about the story begins in the Looney Tunes record shop, and he says just up the street from the Berklee College of Music, and I was like, that is so cool because I know I've been in that record shop, you know. But anyway, so that's part of it. I think part of it's that there's this. When he's speaking in the first person, he's nearly always talking about. It seems like he's nearly always talking about himself in some way. I don't think the stories are necessarily autobiographical, but they are just his direct thoughts. So that's part of it. Anyway, moving on ahead to Scheherazade, this was actually an interesting story to me. Obviously, most people will know that Scheherazade is the framing device narrator for 1001 Arabian Nights. It is 1001 Arabian Nights, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. Those stories. She's the framing device for that story, that set of stories. The idea being that Scheherazade would tell to ensure that you have this emperor that was marrying a woman and spending the night with her and executing her the next day. And in order to stay alive, Scheherazade starts telling the emperor stories, and she would start one day and finish it the next day, so that he would never execute her in the morning, wanting to know what happened. Anyway, this one really gave me pause, because what's interesting here, it's a story. Really, it's called the book is called Men Without Women. This was the one that was almost like Women Without Men in a way, and the story, the narrator in this story, not the narrator, but the person that's receiving the story that's being told by this woman. It's hard to say who the protagonist is. The narrator that's interacting with this woman, or the primary character that's interacting with this woman, who in her own story is the primary character. He is obviously he's in some kind of, it's never fully specified, but maybe in some kind of mental institution or hospital or something. For whatever reason, he's under some kind of care, and he cannot go outside for whatever reason. He cannot leave the building, or his apartment, in this little institution that he's in. And so he has this woman who brings him food and books and CDs and DVDs and all of that, and she has sex with him. And he says it's not necessarily, it's not that she's totally mechanical about it, but she's not like loving or passionate about it. It really is just like this, one of the services that we provide kind of thing. And the thing is, though, she starts telling him, after they're making love and done making love each time, she tells him a little more of the story about this boy that she was obsessed with when she was in high school. So much so obsessed with him that she started sneaking in to his house when no one was there. And what's interesting is it's anticlimactic in a lot of ways, but for me, Murakami has a way of making you feel okay with an anticlimax, if that makes sense. Like he has a way of making you feel okay with the fact that this is not fully resolved or satisfactorily resolved. So it's an interesting idea, and it is an interesting perspective on obsession, and kind of like thinking about maybe how those events maybe influence this woman to become the person that she is now, which is this kind of housekeeper / sex therapist person for this whatever institution this is. So it was interesting. It was an interesting meditation. What did you think?
Oh, anytime there's no plot in a story, I just tear it to pieces. I try to invent a plot. Like I'm thinking, because the stories she was telling were kind of criminal, I'm thinking, okay, maybe she has a criminal background, or maybe she has even more criminal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like, this guy is also, maybe he's part of the Yakuza, or he's home-ridden for security reasons, so he can't go outside. People are looking for him. He knows something, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So the Yakuza bring this housewife of 2
Mm-hmm.
kids to buy him magazines and DVDs and have sex. It's like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Why is this happening? Why is she doing this? So I'm assuming she got hooked up into some sort of criminal underworld, but she's still, she's not a crazy lunatic. She's not a murderer. So she's trying